A single-wall tent on a gravel bar, torn open along one side. One lateral swipe, not a slow, investigative nudge, but a rapid, forceful motion that split the fabric from floor to ridge line. Inside, a sleeping bag dragged halfway through the opening. A bear banger sitting in the vestibule, unfired. A canister of bear spray clipped to a pack strap, its seal still intact. And beyond the tent, 19 meters of drag marks scored into wet gravel, leading toward the tree line before vanishing into dense undergrowth. This is what conservation officers found when they arrived by helicopter. To understand how this happened, you have to understand where it happened. British Columbia's Central Coast is a landscape that does not answer to human schedules. A network of salmon-bearing rivers cuts through valleys walled by old-growth Sitka spruce and western red cedar. Trees that have stood for centuries in air so saturated with moisture it clings to your skin. There is no road access. Cell service is non-existent. The nearest settlement is reachable only by float plane or jet boat, and even those options depend on weather windows that open and close without warning. It is country that rewards experience and punishes assumptions. The man who flew in that late September had both in abundance. A seasoned angler in his late 50s, he had fished these watersheds for over 2 decades. He knew the rivers. He knew the tides that governed their flow. He knew which gravel bars held steelhead and which ones washed out after autumn rains. He was here for a week-long trip, alone by choice.
But before we get to the environmental forensics of this campsite, a brief word. If this kind of detailed, case-by-case analysis is what you come here for, the behavioral science, the environmental factors, the lessons buried in these tragedies, then consider hitting subscribe and the like button. It tells me to keep doing the deep research on these incidents rather than skimming the surface. Most channels won't spend 20 minutes walking you through drag path evidence and salmon corridor data. I will. That's the commitment. Now, back to that gravel bar and what the conservation officers found when they examined the food storage setup, targeting the fall steelhead run that draws a small fraternity of dedicated fly fishers to these corridors every year. He established his camp on a gravel bar roughly 40 meters from the river's edge, a site he had used in previous seasons. The setup was practical, not careless. A single-wall tent staked into the cobble. Food stored in dry bags and positioned near a log jam. A small cook station arranged downwind of the sleeping area. It was the camp of a man who understood the basics of coexisting with wildlife in bear country. He had done this before, many times. But late September on the Central Coast is not a static environment. It is a threshold. And in the autumn of this particular year, every biological system in the drainage was accelerating toward a single imperative: hyperphagia, the pre-hibernation feeding frenzy that peaks in late September and October. It is the period when a grizzly bear's metabolism shifts into a state of relentless caloric acquisition. A bear in hyperphagia is not browsing. It is not wandering. It is consuming, averaging 20 hours of active foraging per day, driven by a hormonal urgency that overrides caution, overrides territorial boundaries, overrides the wariness that normally keeps these animals at a distance from anything unfamiliar. Every resident grizzly in the drainage had become a calorie-seeking machine, operating on a clock the fisherman could not see. And there were more of them than most people would ever want to imagine sharing a river with. Wildlife officers later confirmed that at least 9 grizzlies were working a 3-kilometer stretch of the same river, all of them feeding on spawning chum salmon that choked the shallows in thick, dark-backed schools. 9 bears in 3 kilometers. The gravel bar where the fisherman pitched his tent sat squarely in the middle of that corridor.
Among those 9 was one animal that demands particular attention. A large-bodied male, estimated between 400 and 450 kilograms. A bear whose size alone placed it at the apex of the local hierarchy. Its tracks had been documented near the gravel bar in the days before the fisherman even arrived. It had already been using that stretch of river. It already knew the ground. The fisherman did not know any of this when he set up camp. He had no way of knowing.
He had returned to a site that had served him well for years, in a season he had fished many times before. But the gravel bar was no longer what it had been. It sat at the center of an active salmon corridor during the most intensive feeding period of the Grizzly calendar, and something was already close. On the second evening, as dusk settled over the valley, the wind shifted, and it carried something new downstream: the scent of a freshly filleted steelhead, and the residual fish odor clinging to a pair of waders hung to dry at the edge of camp. A 400-kilogram male grizzly is working the same salmon corridor. Dusk is settling over the gravel bar, and the fisherman has just finished processing a steelhead. It is the second evening, and what investigators would later piece together begins here, with scent. The filleted steelhead had been processed that afternoon on a flat stone near the cook station. Knife work, rinsing, the quiet routine of a man who had done this hundreds of times. But every cut released volatile compounds into the air, and the breeze carried them downriver in a low, spreading plume. The waders hanging near the tent still held residual fish odor from the morning's wade. Blood proteins, mucus, the particular signature of salmonid flesh that a grizzly's olfactory system can isolate at distances measured not in meters, but in kilometers. 2 scent sources, 2 separate trails, both pointing to the same gravel bar. Investigators believe the bear first registered the camp sometime around dusk. Not a chance encounter, a follow. What is notable is that the fisherman was not oblivious. Boot tracks pressed into the wet gravel near the logjam told a story of their own. He had walked to his food bags, moved them, repositioned the dry bags at least once, likely after spotting sign along the bank. Disturbed gravel showed where he had paused, perhaps scanning the tree line, perhaps listening. He knew bears were nearby. 2 decades on these rivers had given him that much, yet he stayed. He did not break camp. He did not activate the satellite communicator to request early extraction. He adjusted what he could and settled in for the night, trusting the same judgment that had brought him home every season before this one. Darkness came early. Late September on the Central Coast, and by 8, the river was a black line between blacker walls of spruce. The gravel bar, open, exposed, no canopy overhead, offered visibility in daylight. At night, it offered nothing. A single-wall tent on open ground, a man in a sleeping bag, and somewhere in the timber, a bear that had not stopped foraging. Grizzlies in the grip of hyperphagia do not observe human schedules. They feed through the darkest hours, moving along the river corridors with a purpose that has nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with caloric desperation. Between dusk and the early morning, the bear would have been active, working the salmon pools, circling back along established trails. The camp sat directly in that circuit. Sometime between 2 and 4 in the morning, the grizzly entered the camp perimeter. What happened next took seconds. Forensic examination of the tent fabric revealed a single lateral tear. Not the slow, exploratory push of a bear investigating a novel object, not a nudge, not a paw pressed tentatively against nylon. This was a rapid, forceful swipe from a forelimb. One motion. The tent wall opened from seam to floor. There was no preamble, no warning huff, no circling. The bear did not pause or probe before acting. Drag marks began at the tent site. They extended 19 meters toward the tree line. 19 meters of displaced gravel, torn fabric, and flattened undergrowth, scoring a direct line from the sleeping area into dense bush. The fisherman had been pulled from his sleeping bag and carried into the undergrowth. 19 meters. In darkness.
in silence that came after whatever sounds there were. Inside the tent vestibule, a bear banger sat unfired. It had been placed there, within reach, positioned for exactly this scenario. A few feet away, clipped to a pack strap, a canister of bear spray. Its seal was still intact, never deployed, never even uncapped. The distance between the point of contact and the nearest deterrent was less than an arm's length. Close enough to touch, not close enough to matter. The speed of the encounter had rendered both objects decorative.
By the time the tent wall opened, there was no interval in which a human hand could have reached, grasped, aimed, and fired. The following afternoon, a radio operator logged a missed contact. The Fisherman had a scheduled radio check-in, a standard protocol for solo backcountry users in the region. When the window passed without a signal, conservation officers were dispatched by helicopter. They reached the gravel bar within hours, located the campsite, confirmed the fatality. Along the drag path, hair samples clung to splintered branches where the bear had pushed through the undergrowth. Officers collected them carefully, bagged them, sent them for DNA analysis. The results would come back, matching a profile already in the regional database. The large male, the one whose tracks had been documented on this gravel bar days before. The scene had been read, the evidence collected. Now the question shifted from what had happened to something harder. Was this a defensive reaction? A bear startled at close range, lashing out in fear? Or was it something far more deliberate?
The lab results came back within days. DNA extracted from the hair snagged on those splintered branches along the drag path matched the large male already in the regional database. This was not an unknown animal. This was the same bear whose tracks had been documented near the gravel bar in the days before the Fisherman even arrived. He had been there first. Conservation officers now faced the determination that would dictate every decision that followed. They conducted a necropsy-level behavioral assessment, examining the full sequence of the bear's actions, its approach, its timing, its conduct before and during the attack. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The attack was classified as predatory rather than defensive. That distinction matters. A defensive attack is reactive. A sow with cubs charges because she perceives a threat to her young. A bear startled on a trail at close range strikes out of fear, out of instinct, and usually disengages once the perceived threat is neutralized. This was none of those things. This bear had no cubs. It had not been surprised. It had not stumbled into a confrontation it didn't want. It approached a stationary, food-associated target during peak nocturnal foraging hours, deliberately, with intent. It treated the camp and the man inside it as a food source. There was no bluff charge, no warning. The single lateral tear through the tent wall was not investigative. It was acquisitive. 48 hours after the fatality was confirmed, the bear returned to the camp perimeter. Officers destroyed the animal at the site. A predatory bear that has associated a human presence with food and has already killed will not unlearn that association. The decision, while final, was not discretionary. It was protocol. But destruction of the animal did not close the investigation. What remained was the landscape itself and the question of how a man with more than 20 years of experience in these watersheds had been placed in a situation where none of that experience could save him. Investigators walked through the environmental forensics point by point, and each factor fed the next like links in a chain pulled tight. First, food storage proximity. The dry bags were staged near a log jam, but that log jam sat close to the sleeping area, not the several hundred-meter separation recommended in Grizzly country during salmon season. The distance was enough for a casual trip. It was not enough when 9 bears were working a 3-kilometer stretch of the same river. Second, scent residue on gear left inside the camp. The waders carried fish odor. A steelhead had been filleted that afternoon. In a drainage saturated with the smell of spawning chum, those traces were not background noise to a bear in hyperphagia. They were a signal, a direct one. Third, campsite placement. The gravel bar sat directly on an active salmon corridor, 40 meters from the river's edge. It was a site the Fisherman had used in previous seasons. Familiar, convenient, close to the water he was there to fish. It was also squarely inside the transit lane of every bear moving between feeding pools after dark. Fourth, the absence of an electric fence. A portable electric fence around the tent perimeter would not have guaranteed survival, but it would have introduced a consequence to the bear's approach, a deterrent at the boundary rather than a bear banger left unfired inside a vestibule. No fence was deployed. Each of these factors, taken alone, was survivable. Anglers across British Columbia's backcountry made identical choices that same autumn and came home without incident. The food storage was imperfect but not reckless. The campsite was established, not improvised. The scent on the gear was an unavoidable byproduct of the activity itself. Any one of these conditions could have been absorbed by a normal season in a normal drainage. But this was not a normal season.
British Columbia recorded its highest number of human-grizzly conflicts in a decade that same autumn. The root cause was structural. A compressed salmon run had concentrated the fish into a shorter window and a narrower geography, which in turn funneled bears and backcountry users into the same narrow river corridors at the worst possible time. Hyperphagia was peaking. Bear density along the salmon-bearing rivers was at its highest. And into that corridor walked a man carrying the scent of fish, sleeping without a fence, on a gravel bar a large male had already claimed. No single mistake killed him. 20 years of experience did not fail because of one oversight. It failed because a half-dozen individually manageable choices landed simultaneously on a landscape where every variable had already shifted toward maximum danger. The accumulation was the thing. That autumn, across British Columbia's central coast, bears and humans continued to converge on the same narrow river corridors, drawn by the same compressed salmon runs, governed by the same invisible calendar. The corridors have not widened since.